We find simple ideas very attractive. We enjoy that moment of insight, feeling we really understand or know something. All problems have a single cause, something we must always be completely against. Or all problems have a single solution, something we must always be for. There's just one small problem. We completely misunderstand the world. I call this preference for single causes and single solutions the single perspective instinct. I love subject experts and I rely heavily on them to understand the world. When I know, for example, that all population experts agree that population will stop growing somewhere between 10 billion and 12 billion, then I trust that data. And when I know that experts disagree about what causes economic growth, that's extremely useful too, because it tells me I must be careful. Probably there's not enough useful data yet. Or perhaps there's no simple explanation. I love experts, but they have their limitations. I presented at all kinds of activist conferences because I believe educated activists can be crucial for improving the world. Recently, I spoke at a conference on women's rights. I strongly support their cause, but I do not support their levels of factual ignorance. 292 young feminists had travelled to Stockholm from across the world to coordinate their struggle to improve women's access to education. But only 8% knew that 30-year-old women have spent, on average, only 1 year less than 30-year-old men in school. I'm absolutely not saying that everything is okay. In countries on the lowest income, level 1, some girls still don't go to primary school. There are huge problems with girls' and women's access to secondary and higher education. But on income levels 2, 3, and 4, girls are going to school as much as or more than boys. And even on level 1, almost every girl finishes primary school. This is something that activists for women's education should know and celebrate. This is not a dig at activists for women's rights. But almost every activist I've ever met, whether deliberately or more likely unknowingly, exaggerates the problem to which they have dedicated themselves. There's a saying, give a child a hammer and everything looks like a nail. When you have valuable expertise, you like to see it put to use, sometimes beyond where it is actually useful. So, people with math skills can get fixated on numbers. Climate activists want solar everywhere. And physicians promote medical solutions where prevention would be better. All these solutions are great for solving some problems, but none of them will solve all problems. It's better to look at the world in lots of different ways. I don't love numbers. I'm a huge fan of data. But I love it only when it helps me to understand the reality behind the numbers. People's lives. In my research, I need the data to test my hypotheses, but the hypotheses themselves often emerge from talking and listening to people. When the then Prime Minister of Mozambique, Pascoal Makumbi, visited Stockholm, he told me that his country was making great economic progress. I asked him how he knew. After all, the quality of the economic statistics in Mozambique was probably not very good. Had he looked at GDP per capita? I do look at those figures, he said. But I've also made it a habit to watch the marches on May the 1st every year. They're a tradition in our country. And I look at people's feet and what kind of shoes they have. I know that people do their best to look good on that day. And I know that they cannot borrow their friend's shoes because their friend will be out marching too. So I look. And I can see if they walk barefoot, or if they have bad shoes, or if they have good shoes. The Prime Minister looked at the numbers, but not only at the numbers. And of course, some of the most valued and important aspects of human development can't be measured in numbers at all. We can estimate suffering from disease using numbers. We can measure improvements in material living conditions using numbers. But the end goal of economic growth is individual freedom and culture. And these values are difficult to capture with numbers. The world can never be understood without numbers, nor can it ever be understood with numbers alone. Medical professionals can be very single-minded about medicine, or even a particular kind of medicine. In the 1970s, a Danish public health doctor, Halfdan Mahler, suggested to the World Health Organization a way to eradicate tuberculosis. His project sent small buses with X-ray machines trundling around villages in India. It was a simple idea. Eradicate one disease and it's gone. The plan was to X-ray the whole population, find those with TB and treat them. But it failed because the people got angry. They all had tons of urgent health problems, and finally, here was a bus with nurses and doctors. But instead of fixing a broken bone or giving fluids for diarrhea or helping a woman in childbirth, they wanted to X-ray everyone for a disease they'd never heard of. Out of the failure of this attempt to eradicate one single disease came the insight that, instead of fighting this disease or that disease, it's better to provide and gradually improve primary health care for all. Let's look at another overly simple view of the world. I was lecturing at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden and explaining that the big pharmaceutical companies do hardly any research on malaria and nothing at all on sleeping sickness or other illnesses that only affect the poor. A student sitting in the front row said, "Let's punch him in the face." "Aha," I said. "If you explain to me what I will achieve and who I should punch, I could try it. Who should I punch in the face? Is it just anybody who works in one of these companies?" No, it's the boss," said that guy. The blame instinct is the instinct to find a clear, simple reason for why something bad has happened. It makes us exaggerate the importance of individuals or of particular groups. This drive to find a guilty party derails our ability to develop a true, fact-based understanding of the world. It blocks our learning because once we've decided who to punch in the face, we stop looking for explanations elsewhere. To understand most of the world's significant problems, we have to look beyond a guilty individual to the system. In 2015, thousands of refugees drowned in the Mediterranean Sea as they tried to reach Europe in inflatable boats. Images of children's bodies washed up on the shores of holiday destinations evoked horror and compassion. Who was to blame? We soon worked it out. The villains were the cruel and greedy smugglers who tricked desperate families into handing over €1,000 a time for their places in these death traps. But why weren't the refugees travelling to Europe on planes or ferry boats instead of entrusting their lives to rubber rafts? After all, every EU member state was signed up to the Geneva Convention, and it was clear that refugees from war-torn Syria would be entitled to claim asylum under its terms. Well, perhaps they couldn't afford to fly. But we knew that refugees were paying €1,000 for each place on a rubber dinghy. I went online and checked, and there were plenty of tickets from Turkey to Sweden or from Libya to London for under €50. Maybe they couldn't reach the airport. Not true. Many of them were already in Turkey or Lebanon and could easily get to the airport, and they can afford a ticket, and the planes are not overbooked. But at the check-in counter, they're stopped by the airline staff from getting onto the plane. Why? Because of a European Council directive from 2001 that tells member states how to combat illegal immigration. This directive says that every airline or ferry company bringing a person without proper documents into Europe must pay all the costs of returning that person to their country of origin. Of course, the directive also says that it doesn't apply to refugees who want to come to Europe as asylum seekers under the Geneva Convention, only to illegal immigrants. But that claim is meaningless. Because how can the person behind the airline check-in desk work out in 45 seconds whether or not someone is a refugee according to the Geneva Convention? It's impossible. Refugees from Syria with the theoretical right to enter Europe are therefore, in practice, completely unable to travel by air, and so must come over the sea. But why must they come in such terrible boats? Because it's EU policy to confiscate the boats when they arrive, so boats can be used for one trip only. But just as we should look at the systems instead of looking for someone to blame when things go wrong, we should also give more credit when things go right. The invisible actors behind most human successes are dull compared to the all-powerful leaders. Nevertheless, I want to praise them. In 2014, I went to Liberia to help fight Ebola. The fight against the lethal virus was won not by an individual heroic leader or even by one heroic organization like Médecins Sans Frontières or UNICEF. It was won prosaically and undramatically by government staff and local health workers. They created public health campaigns, risked their lives to treat dying patients, and did the dangerous and delicate work of finding and isolating all the people who had been in contact with them. They are brave and patient servants of a functioning society, rarely ever mentioned, but the true saviors of the world. I was 4 years old when I saw my mother load a washing machine for the first time. It was a great day for her. She and my father had been saving money for years to be able to buy it. Grandma was even more excited. She had been heating water with firewood and hand-washing laundry her whole life. Now she was going to watch electricity do that work. She was so excited that she sat on a chair in front of the machine for the entire washing cycle, mesmerized. To her, the machine was a miracle. And it was a miracle for my mother and me too. Because that day my mother said to me, "Now, Hans, we have loaded the laundry, the machine will do the work, so now we can go to the library." In went the laundry, and out came books. And we said, "Thank you, industrialization. Thank you, steel mill. Thank you, power station. Thank you, chemical processing industry, who gave us the time to read books." Today, 2 billion people have enough money to own a washing machine and enough time for mothers to read books. Because it is almost always the mothers who do the laundry. If you really want to change the world, you have to understand how it actually works and forget about punching anyone in the face.